I think the main reason that retail sales are up is because prices are up. So again, this is not people buying more, this is just people paying more. And in fact, in many cases, they're actually buying less. They're just paying so much more that retail sales are up in dollars, but they're down in volume. But also, I think a more important factor is, where are consumers getting all this extra money? Because we know that their wage increases pale in comparison to these price increases. Well, it's actually not a big mystery where they're getting their money. We know they're borrowing it. Household debt just soared to an all-time record high, and so did credit card debt, with jumps that we haven't seen outside of a massive recession, which again is when Americans turn to credit the most because they don't really have any savings to fall back on a rainy day. So when it rains, they whip out their credit cards. And that is a big problem, especially when you have interest rates rising on those credit cards, interest rates rising across the board on all sorts of debt. And that debt burden is going to weigh much heavier on the debtors due to the rise in interest rates, not just the rise that has already occurred, but the rise that's about to occur. And of course, as households are experiencing an increase in the cost of servicing their debt, they're about to experience, or in some cases already are, a decrease in the value of those assets, especially the assets that are levered and are collateral against their debt, their homes. Over the last couple of years, real estate prices are still way up. So consumers still think they're richer, even though they're paying higher interest on their mortgage if they have an adjustable rate mortgage, or if they have a fixed rate mortgage, and then they haven't been impacted by the rise in mortgage rates. But the way they will be impacted is as a homeowner, because the value of their homes is going to go way down. And as a result of the reverse wealth effect, they may end up spending a lot less, but also they don't have the real estate home equity to fall back on, nor can they tap into that equity through a home equity line of credit or something like that. That was a lifeline that in previous recessions, homeowners could take advantage of. Well, this time, they're not going to be able to take advantage of it, and they're certainly not going to be able to do a refi. Refis were really the lifesaver for a lot of homeowners because they were able to refinance their mortgage into a lower rate, and in many cases they could extract some cash and do the refi and still lower their rate and withdraw cash because of the savings from the lower rate. Well, nobody can do that anymore. In fact, nobody wants to refinance their mortgage because the mortgage rates that exist today are much higher than the current rate. And so you can't do a cash out refi, because to do that, you would have to refinance into the current mortgage rate, and nobody would be dumb enough to do that, which means that piggy bank is empty and homeowners can no longer rely on it to pay the bills, so they're using their credit cards more. But at some point, they're going to be tapped out there as well, especially as consumer prices continue to rise, so they have less saved and everything they need to buy is more expensive. Remember, initially, households were flush with savings. The savings rate spiked up because everybody got these stimulus checks. And more importantly, a lot of people that weren't working during the pandemic, their pandemic unemployment checks were double or triple what they used to earn. So they had a lot of money, which they promptly spent. Remember, I talked about that in real time. I didn't think anybody was actually going to save this money. They were just going to spend it. The only reason it took a while to spend some of it is because they were confined to their homes, and so they couldn't really spend as much as they wanted to. But as soon as the economy reopened, they spent. And of course, while they were stuck at home, they did shop online. They bought a bunch of stuff on Amazon and places like that. And you saw some of these spikes, like they were buying Peloton bikes or things that you could do at home. But now that money is gone and there's no new stimulus checks coming. And so without that lifeline, a lot of households are just going to sink. I think the way Americans look for work today is much different than they looked in the past, when people really pounded the pavement looking for a job. The reason that expression came into existence is because people would go door to door, knocking on doors, asking the employers if they needed any help. Hey, I'm unemployed, I'm looking for work, you got any jobs? You would just knock on doors. I even did that myself when I was younger, looking for a job. The best way to find out if somebody needs a job is to ask. That was considered actively looking for a job. And so if you were doing that, then you could demonstrate that you were unemployed. But nobody does that today. Nobody pounds the pavement. Everything is done online. And so a lot of the unemployed who are looking for jobs on the internet are not counted as being unemployed because their activity is considered passive rather than active, even though it's not passive because they've made an effort, they put their resumes out there, their resumes are listed on multiple recruiting sites, and they're hoping that somebody reaches out to them now that they put all that information out there. These people are not being picked up as being unemployed, but I know they're unemployed, and you know that by looking at the labor force participation rate. By the way, in March of this year, it was at 62.4. It's now at 62.2. So even though we've created 2.5 million jobs, the labor force participation rate has gone down despite all those extra jobs. I find it hard to believe that the reason we've seen this big drop in the labor force participation rate is that so many Americans are now so affluent that they just don't have to work. So what makes the most sense to me is that the reason the labor force participation rate has gone down so much is because we're not accurately measuring who is in the labor force. And where you see that the most is in the unemployment rate, because I believe a lot of the people who are currently counted as not being in the labor force, which is why the labor force participation rate is so low, are actually unemployed. They would take jobs if they could find them, but they can't. And the fact that there's so many jobs out there as measured by the help wanted index, when you look at these JOLT numbers, what that just means to me is that employers are looking for workers that have skills that the American workforce simply doesn't have. And that's why there's so many job offerings, because there's so few people actually qualified to take those jobs. And also, I think some of the jobs that are offered, the pay is not lucrative enough to entice people off of welfare or other benefits that they lose the minute they get jobs. In addition, once they take a job, they start paying taxes, so it's a double hit. You not only lose your welfare benefits, but then you have to pay taxes on what you earn. Now, in most cases, it's not the income tax that workers end up paying, but the payroll tax, which is in effect over 15% of their earnings. Yes, they only pay half. The other half is supposedly covered by the employer, but the employer simply pays his half with money that otherwise would have been paid to the worker in the form of higher wages. And so I think that is another disincentive to taking jobs. Although one other recent incentive is perhaps how much money a lot of young people were making trading stocks on Robinhood or trading cryptocurrencies. And so that easy money may have been a reason that a lot of people didn't feel that they needed a job. And that may be changing soon as all of those profits are turning into losses. And a lot of millennials are learning the hard way that being a professional gambler is not a substitute for having an actual